Hi, my name is Greg. I am really not a programmer. I work in a consultancy around AI for execs, but I have been trying to automate some of our work and learn the 365 stack so I can consult our clients. And I thought I would share some of the things I've learned about Power Automate. I found it a brutal learning curve. So today I'm just going to talk about the basic structure of my flows. This is a pattern that is common in programming, but when I started in Power Automate, it didn't occur to me to use it. So it has to do with this try, catch, finally block, and I'll show you how I do it and point out another couple of things as I go. Here's the trigger. I initialize variables here. I usually do that in parallel to conserve vertical space. I have a thing called a flow context, by the way, which is just a JSON object I pass between invocations. So if I call a child, I pass this. Each flow can write information to it, and at the end I can write that to a log. I'll go over logs, what I call run logs later. Another best practice I have is I have a documentation action, and you can just free form type text in here, and it's great to give other developers guidance. It's not full documentation, but if there's some gotchas, if you want to describe in general what this thing does, this can be valuable. Here is the structure, the way that I do it. There is a try block. This is a scope, and you will just put your logic in here. This is where, if you're creating flows today and not using this approach, you just add your logic inside this scope. The value there is that if there's an unexpected error, you can basically design the response to that error. So if you can reasonably anticipate an error, normally you should handle it. I'll talk about error handling another time. But if we go to this scope right below it, and we look at its run after settings, we'll see that if the try block is anything but successful, this block will get executed. And then the finally block gets executed no matter what happens to catch. If it's skipped, if it's successful, if there's an error, this code will always run at the end. And I won't go into too much detail in this video about what I do, but I will show you one interesting thing. So if the try block is anything but successful, and I've added a compose here that does a divide by 0 to generate an error, just to show you. But what I do is first I filter an array, and that array is called result from try. So after try runs, there's an array that represents all the actions in try, and you can filter that based on whether it was an error. So here's my filter query. If its status was failed or timed out, it will capture that. So it will basically just filter this array down to the error information. You can read more about that in the documentation or use Copilot. Then for each of the elements in this filtered array, and if there are none for some reason, this won't run. Power Automate can be a little inconsistent, but usually there should be, for a scope, a result array that comes out. And what I do is I add a bunch of information as an object to an array. So at the top, I declared this array. It's a message array. And if I want to write error messages or info messages, I write them to this array. That gets written to this context that gets passed around. And then I can create what I call a run log that captures all that information. So the error objects that I create in message have a type. This is an error as opposed to info. It has a code. You can just define those per flow or whatever you want to do. I've captured the name of the flow from the workflow function. Look up workflow if you don't use it. There's a kind of human readable error message here. And then I'm iterating through these objects that were in this result array. And I just write that as an object. And I try to capture the correlation ID. There is, again, this workflow function. This is unreliable. Sometimes it comes back, sometimes it doesn't. But let me show you what this looks like when we run it. I'm going to generate an error in the try intentionally by dividing by 0. And we'll run it. And let's look at what happens at runtime. So you can see this compose generated an error. The way error handling works with this is, I have the catch set up to be executed if there's an error up here. It filters the result array. So if we look at the inputs, there are a bunch of, it's an array of actions in try that got executed, and I want to filter it just to get the error ones. So if we look at the output, sure enough, I get all the error information. It was a compose, that's its name, so a bunch of metadata. And then I add that to my message array. I use append array, and if we look at the outputs of this, this is the value that got added to that array. You can see correlation ID is empty, but here's an error message. You can read that, and then all the metadata is there. So the caller could interrogate this message array. I always return it to the caller. They can go through and they can find errors. They could respond to particular errors. It's, I think, a very rich approach to managing this. So think about creating this try, catch, finally block. Think about how you're going to handle errors and how you will create this continuity when you're calling children, because you may have a long chain where parent flow calls a child, calls a child, calls a child. And this basic structure gives you a way to start managing that and capturing information. Hope this was helpful.